article that EDQ published, we think makes two contributions. The first contribution is a new characterization of what type of economic good is trained labor. And we started by the observation that when you have employers involved in a workforce training program, and the experiential learning they provide is essential portion of that experience, that trained labor stops being a private good, and it stops being a private good that generates large positive externalities. So that's really the way Gary Becker and in Economics and Human Capital, that education and training was characterized, which as a private good, but it's one in which there are positive spillovers. We looked at that and said, notice something is different. When you have people working in a workforce training program that employers provide resources to make work and effective, what you really have is a common pool resource. And this is a concept that we took from Elinor Ostrom's work on natural resource systems, where if you're thinking about a shared watershed or an airshed, that those who appropriate or use the good, if they don't also contribute to maintaining it, essentially the system behind it falls apart. So when we look at workforce training that has that experiential component where kids do co-ops or there's equipment that's included, or mentorship is a big part, what you've got is that same type of commons problem that you see in natural resources economy. That is, the graduates of the program, the consumption or the hiring of that graduate, an hour of work of that graduate is rival. So if one employer pays for an hour's worth of work, another employer can't get it. But the problem you've got is that you can't make the hiring of the graduate excludable. And that means restricting it just to those employers that have made the contribution to develop the trained worker. And so when you don't have that, if consumption's rival, but you can't build a barrier or a cash register around in front of it so that the employers are investing their time, can't benefit from it, what happens is they don't get a return on their investment. And if they don't get a return on their investment, then essentially the effort to manufacture, make, or educate that trained labor starts to collapse. So what you're seeing in February 2025, had its roots that goes back to at least 2018, 2019. So long gestation period. We look at, as an economist, we don't do a lot of inductive research like this, but then we kind of came up with this notion of 3 S's: sensing, scaling, serving. How do we go in the field and inductively sense what the issue is, taking economic theory and understand the institutions around it? Then we, in very much of the philosophy of service learning or service leadership, how do we work with a client? Because what I found out is in my applied work, it isn't how wonderful my writing is or how persuasive my talking is, but what makes difference is have a client that make a difference, the client that has a constituency that can make a difference, or a client that can stick with the long-term policy agenda. And in work that I've done on taxation, workforce development, and electricity regulation, I found that the Ohio Manufacturers Association has been a fabulous client. They respect academic freedom. We agree to disagree when it happens. But if it makes sense to them, they'll work on making it part of the agenda. So it turned out that that serving part then came back and reflected in the research because we got to see them build the program. And then scaling, that's where it gave us a chance to test the model and then empirically see what worked. And that's what you're seeing in the journal. I would say that the first contribution that we made was one of conceptualizing the trained graduates as a recognizable economic good, and that is a common pool resource. The second thing that we did was we adapted Ostrom's rules or principles for governing a common pooled resource and adapted them to workforce development. That's new. So, for example, what is the geographic scope of the resource? Often workforce development programs are focused by the political geography who funds them. Well, the geography itself really is the scale of the regional labor market, the area within which people live and work. We've also came down very clearly, again, going from Ostrom, but emphasizing the fact that the manufacturers, as the employers, have to lead, and they really have to have a dominant governance role, but at the same time be inclusive of all other components of making and shaping that resource. So this is really where kind of the social service organizations, the workforce training language, they really have to adapt to the language of the employer to make this thing work. And the employer then has to also be open to learning from the suppliers of the resource. That's hugely important. Self-governance is important, but along with self-governance is the ability to regulate, not to regulate, but to ensure that commitments are being made and that those who benefit from the program benefit in kind of rough proportion to what they contributed to the program. When you look at employer involvement in the literature, what you see is when the first immediate crisis is solved or goes away, it recedes, these programs frequently crash. And why do they crash? Well, usually it's the CEO's personal commitment that makes them the company behave, or the problem's going away and they can't adapt to a similar problem in the labor market. What we saw in this program was when it was set up, there was a huge emphasis on engineering technology and engineering technologists, sort of the applied engineer. But then after COVID, the employment crisis was the loss of semi-skilled machine tenders. And we saw these regional programs really shift to emphasizing the skills that were, as one of the companies that we talked to said, we can't solve the long-term problem if we go bankrupt in the short term. And it's really focused on these semi-skilled machine tenders. Well, when that problem's solved, are they going to be able to actually then start thinking about workforce training for the longer term, very important competitive issues that face American manufacturing? And that's the transition to a digital shop floor, digital operations technology, and also the ability to translate to itself to what used to be the old industrial engineer and get reinvented as an engineering technologist. That would allow us to compete with institutions such as the Fraunhofer program in Germany. And people are listening. I don't get Fraunhofer confused with Freihofer. Fraunhofer, German workers. Freihofer, Pennsylvania chocolate chip cookies. Very important.